All right, hello everybody. Just getting some stuff set up here. I'm hoping that the sound is coming through okay. I think we should be good to go. I hope you're having a nice day. I just wanted to go live today while I work on this lemon painting. Which I'll reintroduce here in just a moment. Actually, I just realized I forgot to grab my tablet. That way, in case anyone does ask a question or leave a comment, I can see it while I'm painting. So just give me a moment. I'm going to go grab that real quick, and then we'll get started. Okay, and we should be good to go. All right, let me get my gloves on here. Sorry about the commercials on Spotify here. I've got this kind of like royalty-free. What's happening here?
Maddie has twins, so she knows just how rewarding a 2-for-1 deal can be. That's why she banks with Landmark Credit Union. With a Landmark Rewards checking account and credit card, Maddie can earn with ease. Then combine rewards and redeem points for gift cards, getaways, tickets, and more.
All right, hang on a moment here. Got a couple things to adjust. Turn down my Spotify here. Okay, I think I've got things figured out here now. Sorry about all the technical difficulties today. I've noticed some stuff on OBS. That's the streaming program that I use for these live streams. And I got some like notifications that I was trying to figure out here, which is fine. I think we're okay here. Anyway, so we're working on this lemon live, small 6x8-inch oil painting. It's on a board, a oil primed linen canvas panel. I make these myself with 1/2-inch pieces of cabinet grade plywood. This is with, I think, birch plywood or maple possibly. So it's pretty high quality, really durable plywood that I mount my canvas and linen onto. And I gave everyone who had seen the last live stream recording a look at a recent painting that's sort of in this same process and kind of train of thought here with floating objects, common everyday objects like different foods, or I've done like eggshells in this series. And what I really love about this particular way of experimenting with painting is that it allows me to play with things like color theory, composition, and just like those fundamental building blocks of painting and representational painting. So this is a recent painting that's almost all the way dry, and I'm hoping to get this painting to a similar sort of like state of finish as this one that I'm holding. And I think I should be able to accomplish that today over the next 1.5 to 2 hours. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into this process. So I've got my palette here that I'll be using. Hopefully the paint is still fairly open and wet enough to use. Because, you know, I've got these two different palettes, one that's off screen right now that you can't see, that's below the easel, basically like right below the screen here. It's open. I might be dipping into some of these piles of paint that I have on the palette. Most of the mixing is going to happen here though. That's the plan. And as I get some of my colors, I might talk about some of those pigments again. But most likely this will be a pretty straightforward, you know, sort of recording here. Let's see. So I think the first thing I want to do is get back into the background of my painting, which, you know, again, I talked about this in the last live stream, but this image that I'm showing, it's mostly just to give you an idea of what I'm looking at. My perspective on the lemon is also slightly different than what we're seeing in that photograph, because my vantage point is actually a little bit lower, and the lemon is turned towards me kind of like this, just slightly, as opposed to the picture. So there's a little bit more of an elongated sense of form in the painting right now. And honestly, I think some of that could be altered by raising this top edge of the lemon just a little bit more. I don't know if I'll end up doing that today. I might choose to do that, but we'll see. So first, let's start with the background here in the painting. I'm going to grab a little bit of my oleo gel medium, a little bit of titanium white. Let's see if this cadmium green can open up here. So I'm using a few of my different yellows on my palette right now. Cadmium green, cadmium yellow medium, yellow ochre. And right away I can tell this is way too bright in value compared to my background. So I'm gonna have to take some of my darker pigments here, like ultramarine blue, and maybe even a little bit of viridian to drop the value. Take a little bit of burnt sienna just to warm that up, but also thinking about chroma and the value. Last night, my wife and I had a friend and my brother over for dinner last night. We made some really delicious steak tacos for just like a really humble little Cinco de Mayo dinner. And after dinner, we played the board game Hues and Cues. I don't know if anybody has played that game before, but it's all about color theory, which is really fascinating as a painter, because, you know, I feel like we have an advantage to games like that because we spend so much time thinking about properties of color and what they remind us of. And how we might describe a color. And I didn't win the game, which was crazy because, it was 1 point away from our friend Katie, who won. And one of the things that came up during the game that was really fun for me was talking about ways that I've learned to talk about color and describe color, and things I talk about during workshops, like the 3 properties of color: hue, chroma, value, or chroma could also be interchanged with saturation. But it was really fun for me to talk about that stuff because I taught a color theory class to a private group a few weekends ago, and a lot of that information was still really fresh in my mind. We talked a lot about the properties of color and how we can use contrast to create visual interest in our work, and to help sort of basically pull the viewer's attention to intentional areas of the composition. I think that's where studying fundamentals of art and painting is so important, is because it reminds us that we as the artist are the ones who have to make these decisions, like what's the most important part of the painting, or how do we want a viewer to interact with visually and engage with the picture plane. And that's, in my experience, why having a good understanding of just like the basic principles of composition and color theory will give you better insight into like ways that you can compose and think about relationships in your paintings. So anyway, playing that game was really fun last night because, if you've never played Hues and Cues, it's a board game that looks like a giant rainbow gradient of color swatches, and on the playing, like the actual board for the game, you can see all of these like subtle shifts as a color moves from yellow to green to red, blue to violet to red. And the way the game works is that you pick up a card, and then as the person whose turn it is, you have to give a cue, a one-word cue, to try and get the rest of the table to place their game piece on the swatch that you're looking at that's chosen on a card that you picked up. And each card has 4 different color swatches on it. And it's a really fun game. It kind of forces you to use your imagination and memory of things that like fit into a particular hue, like things that we would think of as being orange versus blue, versus green, but the particular type of blue or orange or green that you're looking at on the card, that forces you to get a little bit more specific about the way that you're describing and categorizing your color. And where the like conversation about color theory came up was because of what happens when you are looking at a swatch of color, like a little square of a solid color, on a card with 3 other, varying swatches that sometimes are very similar or are what we would call analogous colors because they're close to the same hue or color family. But oftentimes they're not analogous. You have like a particular pink right next to a particular teal, right next to a particular green, and they have a lot of very different qualities to them. And when you're looking at the card versus the board game, you might describe the color on the card differently than you would, or how the person hearing that cue is going to interpret that word. Because they're looking at the board game. It's a really fun game. It's really easy to play, and it's a very casual type of team game. It doesn't take a ton of mental bandwidth to play the game. Not like Magic the Gathering, which is another game that the 4 of us also play on a weekly basis. So it was a nice break from our normal game that we like to play. So I'm noticing that there's this really subtle gradient of light and color shifting from my horizon line, which is that teal thin horizontal line. Right above that, I noticed this really subtle greenish blue, tone or tint on this golden sheet of paper that's behind the lemon, right? You can see that in the photo reference on screen. The light that's bouncing from above, it's coming down onto my still life, is hitting that teal sheet of paper and bouncing up onto the gold paper. So it creates this slightly warmer green version of the teal. And then above that, I'm noticing there's this like slightly rosy gold. The color of the paper has this kind of goldish version of itself that is being picked up by or influenced by the light that's bouncing off of the pink paper. So I'm going to try and get a little bit more of that warm peachy color onto the paper too. But it's close to the local color of the paper, which is that sort of like sunflower gold. So I don't want to get too far away from that. Oh, titanium white is starting to fall down there. Let's just squish that back down. I think this can work. It's a little dark, but I think this will work. And in the last recording, I only had my easel light on, and I turned off my studio lights that are like to the right of the easel. So there might be a little bit more of a glare on the painting today. I might get up here soon and turn off those lights and just see if it makes a difference. I need to make sure that I'll be wrapping up today's live stream by like 3 o'clock at the latest. I'm teaching my last online class of the semester for my students that go to the University of Minnesota Morris today. We have our final critique today, and I'll be in class starting at 4 o'clock, so I need to make sure that I'm prepared for our final critique today. But it should be a really fun afternoon because I like to order pizzas for the students on the last day of the semester. It's a really fun way to close out 3 months of learning online, which if you've never had to take an online class, it's not the greatest format for learning painting, but I will say that all things considered, there's a lot of really great tools that allow learning online to be approachable, and I am happy with the results that the students have created this semester. They've done a really great job playing with concepts and exploring themes that are personal and also just have a lot of authenticity to their relationship of an idea within painting, and I think that one of the things that art school can teach you is how to navigate process and technique, but also how your idea fits into those things, right? And how you relate to the concept that you're portraying in your work, whether that's through a representational language of painting or through an abstract way of painting. And as an instructor, it's always really fun for me to get to watch students develop that lens that's critical of art history, of contemporary art, of their own process. And, to be a small piece in their experience as a student is really, it's really rewarding for me. So it'll be a fun way to end out this semester by looking at their progress over the second half of the semester and get some pizza for them to enjoy. So I'm at this stage in this painting right now where there are really subtle shifts. It might not be as subtle in the video documentation right now, but in person this is reading a bit more nuanced with the darker red on top of this kind of like burnt yellow color that's the background at the moment. And what I like about this stage that I'm in right now for the painting is I can really start to think about intensity or contrast and variety. Those are two of the principles within painting that I think hold the most weight to creating visual interest in a painting. I think variety, as people say, is the spice of life, right? I think we get bored if there's not enough variety within something, whatever the thing is, if it's a song, if it's an experience, if it's a book. As an artist, you want to be mindful of how variety is operating in your work. And that's not to say that there's like a golden rule of like you have to have 60% different visual elements or colors or something in your painting. But I do think that is a way that viewers and yourself as the artist will make sense of the image. And at this particular stage, I've established the majority of the information in the painting. And some artists might watch this video and think, wow, he's really just sort of like over polishing the painting. And I totally understand that kind of interpretation or sentiment. When we look at someone's process or someone's work, we can think like, oh, they're already done. Why are they still painting? The painting is done already. And for me at this particular stage, I feel like it's about what do I want to say, and how do I want to say it. And I'm an appreciator of paintings that have a level of nuance and variety on the surface and within the relationships of the painting. So I look for things that start to stand out when I look at other people's paintings. And I mean, part of that is like a desire to see and find variety, and do I feel like the painting offers a sense of variety across the surface from corner to corner. But even within one shape or one area, I think this was something I was starting to talk about in the first recording of this painting. This pink foreground piece of paper is, it's one solid color. And even when I look down over at the still life, I mean, on the photo reference that I am sharing, you can see like right by the shadow, it appears like there's this lighter patch of that pink color in terms of value. And that's one of the things that I try to really exaggerate or emphasize when I'm painting light on a flat plane or on a surface like this. Is there something I can do to think about variety and to create a little bit more visual interest? So within one large shape or plane, I think that's where you can always continue to look and find that level of difference or that level of specificity and nuance. And as I'm working on a painting, I hit this stage where that's when I start to really prioritize, is this feeling of variety within an area that might otherwise just feel sort of dull and disinteresting. Um, so that being said, let's see what I can do in this area of the painting. I haven't painted at my easel for close to a week now, so some of the paint on the palette is got this like tough skin on the outside that I have to break through either with a brush, or you should probably do it with a palette knife, but when you're in a hurry like I am, you tend to just use the brush. I think my favorite thing about these still life studio paintings is that, unlike some of my plein air work, I'm allowed to take my time and to build up a little bit more variety on the surface here. And I start to really appreciate these like more textured and complex transitions between values or between other color properties, and the way that the marks on the surface relate to one another becomes the thing that really excites me. And this goes back to this question of like, how do you know when you're done with a painting? It can really vary from painting to painting. Some paintings I know I'll hit a point, I'll go, okay, I'm satisfied, and I think this has reached its full potential as an image or as a painting. And in other paintings, maybe it's like there's enough variety coming from the shapes or from line or texture. But when I've got a subject that's like one of these really simple still life compositions, I start to yearn for this like variety of surface quality and just a little bit more of like a density of information. And what happens is, as the painting continues to get refined further and further and further, there's a history that develops on the surface, and that's when I start to become the most satisfied with these paintings, is when I feel like there's a built history of time. And lately that means that each painting needs to have at least 2 different sessions, if not more than 2. So I know I'm going to soften this sort of like rim light here. I don't know if this is technically called the rim light of like the edge of a shadow. Usually we call the rim light the light that's on a form when it's being backlit or like maybe lit from the side. But if I'm talking about the light that follows a shadow, I don't know if there's a more technical term for that. If anyone knows, feel free to share. So I'm working this line of this bright peachy yellow with a mostly dry brush. This is the brush I use to put the paint down, but I've wiped off the majority of the paint off the brush so that this is more of a tool just to help control the edge of that line. And the goal right now is to create a really soft transition of the edges between the light and the shadow. I'm working on a painting that's mostly dry, and I chose not to oil out. That's a technique that you can use if you're going to be glazing and working indirectly, but some of the paint that I put down in the last session is pretty thick, and I know that it's going to smudge and smear if I try to oil out the whole painting. And I mean, if that again is something that you want to do in your work, the solution there is to either do like spot oiling out, where you're only picking the area you plan to paint and you're going to oil out that area for like the session or for that day. A lot of artists work that way. Or you have to wait longer for the paint to dry a little bit more. And if that's the case, you might want to have a couple different paintings going on all at the same time. That way you always have something to work on. Now this color is really different, this light that I'm putting down. So I'm just going to introduce this to other areas of the pink paper. I don't want it to seem like abnormal or out of place in the painting, so we have to share this color with other areas of the ground plane. And let's bring this down here. I make, as I said at the start of the recording here, I make my own panels, and there are a couple of reasons why I prefer to do that. The first reason is a very practical one, which is that you get more for your money if you're willing to make some of the materials yourself. And over the years I've invested in a table saw and a miter saw and some of the woodworking tools that you need to be able to build panels and frames, and that's allowed me to save some of the overhead cost that I invest into my work. Now obviously it's like I have to also make all that stuff, so I spend time to do that, but with that responsibility of making the materials though, I get to control so much of what the object feels like and looks like before I even make the painting. And that's probably the biggest reason why I prefer to make my own supports or panels, is because each one feels unique and it feels organic and it feels handmade, and it just doesn't feel perfect. I think that's really important for the way that I like to paint, and the feeling I'm trying to, the sensation and the feeling I want to give a viewer isn't this like really mechanically accurate and perfect type of object. I like things that have a sense of imperfection to them and just like a roughness to them in terms of character and maybe history. As a kid, one of the habits I had a lot was just this like innate interest in stuff in people's houses, especially things that felt different and maybe out of place, like things that someone maybe was gifted or inherited that they you can tell it doesn't really fit the style or like the personality of the rest of their belongings. And that always would pique my interest, and I would wonder like, well, what is this thing? Why is it in their house? How do they get this? And most of those objects that would lure me in, I felt like they also had this sense of organic texture and character to them. Maybe they were a little bit wonky or chipped or scuffed, dusty. They just didn't feel polished and super clean and neat. And I've always really gravitated towards that sense of character of stuff. So when I learned how to make canvases and panels as an art student, there was this like aha moment where I realized how much the final feeling your work gives to a viewer is rooted in those properties of its physical form, and the image is this like skin on top of the object. So however you manipulate the surface or the physical form of your canvases and your panels is going to say a lot about the feeling and the atmosphere and the mood that your image is going to convey. And since my time as an art student, I've spent a lot of the years learning how to refine the process of making panels and then frames, and just trying to get more and more equipped and comfortable with the material side of painting. And when we're learning how to paint, that can be a really seductive and exciting part of the process. And learning how to paint is like just becoming more and more familiar with the tools. And some people will say, well, you don't want to get so interested in the tools of painting, like the physical materials, to the point where that's all you're thinking about is like a certain brand of paint or a certain brush or a certain kind of linen. That's not going to help you make a great painting necessarily. So it's all part of this larger balance of the process still. But I think that's something that you lose some of that power when you purchase like a ready-made canvas from a store, especially like these big warehouse stores like Michael's. Not that there's anything wrong with buying stuff from those types of stores, but they all look the same. All of those canvases and panels all have the same texture and character and color and just like overall sort of makeup in their properties. And that's why I think I would struggle if I wanted to make a painting on a store-bought like panel nowadays, because I really love just like this little border edge of the panel. I mean, it might be kind of hard to see on camera, but like there are all of these little tiny deviations to that edge of the linen and the character of that texture is really, really satisfying. And I'm all, when I make a painting, I'm already partially satisfied by the object. And that's a really important thing that I know for myself. It adds a lot of value to how I approach my work, because it forces me to really be more intentional about my paintings and about what it is I want them to convey. And where was I going with that? I think if I'm the one who's making the panel, then I know how hard it was and how much time it took to get it to the moment of being ready for painting. And when we just go and buy a panel or a canvas, sometimes it doesn't feel like there's as much pressure to really be intentional, because you're like, and I'm speaking from experience, like I used to buy a lot of stuff from stores. I'm not trying to like pick on anybody, but I used to buy things before I had a table saw, before I knew how to make frames and all that stuff. I think most artists, we source what we can from these different places, and hello Melky, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Thanks for tuning in, I really appreciate it. I'm just sort of like chatting right now about the canvas panels and the character of the surface and the object and how that relates to my process, and really appreciate you tuning in today. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for the positive feedback. This is a series I've been toying with for the last year, and it's really fun. I've really enjoyed this like illusion of objects floating above a picture plane or a ground plane, and painting from observation. So I've got my photo reference on screen that you can see, but then off screen to the left of my easel here, I have the lemon on a tabletop with a spotlight above it, and I'm painting it from direct observation. And I'm hoping that I can finish the painting today, but we'll see. Rarely does it work out that way, but that's part of the goal. In the last live stream, I had I think it was 2 hours, actually it might have been 3 hours, the last live stream. And in that recording, most of what I was doing was trying to build up the image and get things like large proportions, main color relationships, values, all of those sort of like formal qualities down. And now I can really think about like the character of the painting and the feeling that I want some of these shapes to have, so I can use smaller tools and smaller brushes to really dial in like a certain texture or contrast. This is a stage in the process that I always feel is akin to like cooking a meal, and you're just waiting to boil out more of the water of like a pasta or something, pasta sauce or something like that. And you've already got like the flavor figured out. You've already got like some of the key ingredients in the dish, but now it's like a texture thing that you're trying to chase and trying to resolve. It's kind of how I feel this stage is for me in my process. Like really I'm just thinking about like the character of a shape or a mark, and if I like it or if it's too distracting. But I really want to make sure that I have this lemon finished in the next day, because it's going to start to shift its properties here pretty soon if I take too long. A couple of these little ripples in the lemon peel that I'm really excited to paint in here. Right now I'm using this, let's see, it's a Richardson. I think most of the brush information has been wiped off over the years. It's a number 2. It's kind of like a long flat that's made out of sable, natural sable hair. It's a really nice brush. It's super soft and delicate with like the amount of control I can have, but I like this for putting down a very small mark, but also blending the edge of that mark. Before I forget, I do want to soften this front edge of the shadow here. And the surface quality of the painting in most of the areas is very tacky right now, I would say. Like, it's very sticky. Not sticky in the sense that like the brush is wanting to like not come off the surface, more so in like the way that the paint is adhering to what's already there. It's not like really dry. Sometimes if you wait a really long time to continue working on an oil painting, you can struggle a little bit with the texture because the paint might have very dry, almost like brittle surface quality. And if you're used to something that feels a little bit more slick or accepting of the paint, that could be a really frustrating experience. But I actually have grown to really like this property of a partially dry painting. I like when it's a little sticky like this because it accepts the oil paint in a really satisfying way. And most of my process these days is really, I wouldn't say opaque necessarily, but it's not a very like diluted, washy type of paint consistency. I used to paint a lot more with mediums that were fluid, that would allow me to work in a very thin layer of oil paint, which I'm really grateful for those experiences, because originally I'd spent a lot of time painting with acrylics and watercolor, which I think is common for a lot of people. It's rare that I think someone learns how to paint as a kid or as a young adult with oils before watercolor or acrylic. But, you know, sort of transitioning between watercolor and then into oil, I was very comfortable with like thinking in layers and very thin washes of paint. And not only was that financially a great way to paint because I was using less oil paint, which is expensive, but also I really learned how to think in terms of layers and how to use layers in like a stacking sense, like as opposed to making a drawing on a panel and then like with pencil or something, and then going through and filling in all of those shapes, kind of like a paint by number way of painting. And because of that, like, thinking more in terms of layers, I feel like you end up with moments in a painting that you don't really plan for that sometimes you really love. And I think that's really important as an artist, is to try to allow for opportunities of surprise and maybe even like a lack of control over the process, just to keep things from being too formulaic or too stale. I think that's something that we can overlook as artists sometimes, is this idea that we have to master our craft and we have to master our approach and the way that we like to paint and all that sort of stuff. But you can also kind of lose track of the benefits to not knowing everything and not knowing what's gonna work out in the end. So anyway, where I was sort of going with that was that by painting in layers, you kind of accept this idea, like, I might cover this up, I might later on choose that this isn't worth sharing in the final surface of the painting, and I'll cover it up, and I think that's another thing I really love about painting as a medium, is that you can really play with revealing or covering or hiding information, and forcing the viewer to really work hard to understand or to notice these, like, almost like narrower underlying areas of information, that were potentially covered up, right? Like, you have to really focus as a viewer and really use your imagination to think, well, maybe it's this that's underneath that shape on the surface that I can't actually see, but I have to imagine what that could be. So even though I'm not working with very fluid, thin layers of paint these days, I am still very open to layering as kind of a conceptual framework for my paintings too, and how areas of the image relate to one another through how explicit something is or how ambiguous something is. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like I'm kind of just rambling and like art speak a little bit right now, which sometimes is good, sometimes it's not good, but for anyone who's interested in seeing more of my process and hearing about ideas and things that influence the way that I work, that's a lot of the kind of conversation I have, either with other artists or in my own, my own mind, my own isolated studio here.
Sometimes historic events suck. But what shouldn't suck is learning about history. I do that through
All right, so right now
that doesn't suck is a chart-topping history.
I'm trying to push the complement of the yellow,
I've been chronicling the epic
and I have this very vibrant violet color that I just added in, which I'm not totally sold on. I don't know if it's really doing what I thought it was going to do, but I think that's when we have to just sort of like keep pushing the color.
I actually realized how relevant the story still is in 2023. The fact that reading it out loud made me see the story in a different way. This is J.R. Jameson. My memoir, Hillbilly Queer, is now on Spotify. Listen today.
Okay, so let me just test something. I'm going to turn off my studio light here. I'm hoping that will help cut out some of the glare on the painting. The palette I don't think really is that big of a deal. It's more the painting that I'm concerned with the glare. I think that's a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to see this gray violet color now. Part of my goal right now is to enhance the glow on the top of the lemon, and one of these techniques I'm trying is to use the contrast of complements. And you know, again, if you have some experience with color theory and these like universal types of color contrast, you know, if you identify what your goal is in the painting, you can use one of those contrasts by someone like Johannes Itten to experiment with a particular relationship in your painting. So for me right now, it's like, okay, how do I get this yellow to really pop and glow off the top of the lemon? And in my last painting that I showed at the start of the stream, I employed a similar technique where I was really focused on the complementary relationship between the sort of like blue background and the yellow lemon. I snuck in a slightly more purpley blue right on the edge. And I think that's maybe my issue right now, is that there's a little bit of, there's too much of a jump, I think, between the yellow of the lemon and this sort of like violet color. So I'm going to tone that down just a little bit, or like neutralize it a little bit here with some yellow. And maybe if I lighten the value, that can also help too. But the violet line that's still in the painting is going to do a lot to help enhance that contrast still, even if it's mostly covered up. Okay, I like that. I think that added just the right amount of contrast there. For now, I might go back in later and adjust some of that, but I think for right now it's at a good spot. So I'm going to take some of my cadmium yellow medium and yellow ochre to create a nice mustardy yellow. And I just want to go in and really pop this top part of the lemon here. So I'm noticing that some of the values in the shadow are a little bit darker than what I have in the painting. And this is a really good chance to also describe some of the kind of like bumps and folds in the lemon's form and character here. So this is serving a few different purposes for me right now.
made for real relaxation. Whether it's a weekend away or the start of a new tradition, spring is better by the water. And at the Osthoff Resort and Spa, that's where sunshine season begins. Visit osthoff.com to start planning your stay.
think I'm getting pretty close to being done with this painting. I think the lemon is probably almost done now.
Protein-packed meals in 10 minutes? TikTok's got millions of them. Could you whip one up in under 8? Probably. But hey, it's not a race. Grab the recipes on TikTok and start cooking.
This is Emily Lynn Paulson, author of Hey Hun, Sales, Sisterhood, Supremacy, and the Other Lies Behind Multi-Level Marketing. My awakening and eventual escape took time. Nearly everyone who joins an MLM starts out as a victim with very good intentions, leaving the Smart Shuffle adds recommendations into your playlist, shifting new sounds, or you can use it as shifts.
Okay, I think that's pretty much there. Pretty happy with how this painting is looking right now. The one thing I know I might still fiddle with kind of off camera is the side of the shadow over here. It just doesn't quite make sense the way that I'm hoping it will. But I know it's going to take a while to kind of resolve that area and figure that out. I do think that where the painting is at right now is a good place to stop the recording and just say thanks to anyone who watched this. I hope it was helpful or inspiring to some degree. And if you'd like to learn more about my work, I hope you'll visit my website, acunaarts.com. It's linked down in the description of this video. You can also find more information about my work on Instagram at Hector Acuna _art. Also, if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, I hope you'll consider subscribing, and make sure to click the notification icon. That way you're notified if I'm going to be live again in the future. But yeah, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and checking this out. If you want to, see this painting once it's finalized, at some point it will end up documented on my website. And yeah, you can find more of my work there as well. So thanks for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, your evening, your week, and I will talk to you soon.